Now, today I have an enormous amount of stuff to cover, and I have no idea whether we'll make it. The good news is that 2 classes down the road, I have a no study, kind of an open. Every once in a while, you'll see in your syllabus something that says open class. That means that those are classes that I put in there specifically to catch up if I've fallen behind, and to entertain questions of yours if you have any. Also, if you have an album that you want to play. That's last on my list, but I still reserve that for whatever you want to do is basically what an open class is. And of course, review is high on the list too. So today we're going to cover 2 things which are pretty crucial. The 300-year cycle is first. That's a principle which leads into our study of the first actual music we're going to look at, which is the medieval period. Now, every historian of any kind has some theory of history that he likes to promote. They almost always fall to the ground because it's hard to figure out a theory of history. There are so many different ways of looking at it, and as we look for patterns, we can see patterns emerge, but they don't always. Everybody doesn't always see the same patterns, and sometimes the patterns shift around. But I've been teaching this class for something like 20 years, and the 300-year cycle seems to continue to hold water for me, and it's very helpful in understanding the big picture of music history. So remember that music history is about 1,000 years, starting at 1000 AD. It's a very convenient time to call it 1000 AD, because that's a little bit after the first efforts of developing music notation, as we talked about in our first class. Now this is something you'd be tested on. The age of melody is from the year 1000 to 1300. Notice these are in 300-year blocks. Notice this first. The age of counterpoint, 1300 to 1600. The age of harmony, 1600 to 1900. And the age of sound quality from the year 1900 to now and beyond. That would be 2200, I guess, huh? 20, yeah. We'll be more specific about these as we go on. But the 300-year cycle states that something begins, and then it reaches a peak of development, and then begins a decline. At the end of its decline, a new thing happens. Evolution is not always gradual. Sometimes, take your family, for instance. You may inherit your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's nose. And your great-great-great-great-grandfather gave his nose to your great-great-great-grandfather, and your great-great-great-grandfather gave it to your great-great-grandfather, and your great-great-grandfather gave it to your great-grandfather, your great-grandfather gave it to your grandfather gave it to your father, and then suddenly you marry a Martian, and suddenly introduce into your gene pool a completely different nose. This is maybe I just made this example up just now. Pretty cool, huh? It just goes to show that sometimes something completely new comes in to change things around in a very radical way. Where things may have been evolving very stepwise from point to point to point, and then suddenly something very radical happens. That's basically what the 300-year cycle states, is that every 300 years, something new enough so it changes in a very radical way the flow of history happens. And so the life of an idea extends from its origin through its development, the peak of stylization, to its final decay. The new ideas that happen in 1000, 1300, and 1600 are these. The age of melody begins with the origin of music notation. We had a whole big class about that. I hope you enjoyed that, because I find it very interesting, although you won't be tested on very much of it. Isn't that fun to know? Then, by the year 1300, music notation has achieved a sufficient level of stylization so that you can actually start. See, remember, the purpose of the original music notation was to what? Remind me. What was the purpose of music notation? Somebody invented it for a specific reason. To record and preserve, unchanged by oral tradition, the tunes that had been inherited from the distant past, from as early as the time of Jesus. But by 1300, composers were now inspired to use this fancy notation system to actually create new things. That doesn't mean that people never made up new things before 1300, but again, they were never written down. So we have no record of those things until about the year 1300. In 1300, the first known composers. Why do I say known composers? Who are the composers of Gregorian chant?
The monks.
It's so easy to talk to you because you're right there. Does anybody in Valdez have an answer to these questions? Who wrote the Gregorian? The monks wrote them down. The monks didn't make them up.
Oh.
We don't know who made them up.
Who wrote them?
They wrote them down, but they didn't compose them. These were inherited by musicians from way, way, way in the distant past. They're anonymous. Nobody knows who wrote them. Not only that, but the monks that you're talking about, who later were involved in writing down the chants that we have, they were also anonymous. Most of the music written before 1300 is anonymous, and a lot of it after is anonymous. But with the invention of music notation, known composers begin to emerge, and we start to be able to attach a name to a specific musical composition. We have poets that are known all the way back in the way distant past. We have Homer, and we have Aeschylus, and we have Sophocles, you know. But we don't have any Greek musicians. They're all unknown. Okay, so by 1600, counterpoint has turned into harmony. And we begin the period that this is normally called the beginning of the modern period. Descartes, the French philosopher, was from the 1600s, the I think, therefore I am guy. That was basically the beginning of the modern age. We start, by 1700, we have a big industrial revolution. People are making machines. The modern age begins in 1600. And the music that we relate to most easily, and all the music that we are going to look at, starts to be written at this time. Now, in 1900, we have a whole new way of preserving music. The tape recorder. The tape recorder. See, if we had only had a tape recorder in 1000, then Pope Gregory wouldn't have had to go to all that trouble to figure out a way to write it down. Isn't that great? I mean, what a loss to never have had the necessity of having it written down. So anyway, that's basically the scam of the 300-year cycle. What I want you to know is the age of melody, the age of counterpoint, the age of harmony. Now, remember that this 300-year cycle has about 150 rise. The new thing starts at the beginning of this period, 1000, then 150 years later, at 1150 is the peak, and then it begins a decline. And that pattern is very discernible throughout history. A lot of people think that history is speeding up, that there's so much more information now than there was even 50 years ago, that this represents some sort of acceleration of history. I am in denial of that because I think that proportionally, history pretty much goes along at the same rate. I may be wrong, but I see the cycles of history going along at the same sort of the eternally, cosmically staid pace. Maybe it's because I'm so old. Okay, the development, the peak development of stylization, which we've been talking about, would be at 1150, which is where the real beginning of musical creativity began. In 1450, the beginning of the Renaissance, and in 1750, the Sonata Allegro. We'll cover all these things later. And of course, in 1960, one of the groundbreaking works of recording with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. These represent to me peaks of stylization. This may be, how many are confused by this point? Is that, I caught you at the very end. Is that Wesley?
We're good.
Did Wesley raise his hand?
No.
Okay.